Connections Radio presents.
Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm host Ian Rachiele. And on this edition, we are going to be kind of doing a retrospective, and we're going to be looking back at one of the most notable names that was one of the young guys, a young up-and-coming player, someone who was supposed to be a bright spot for your Vegas Golden Knights, and unfortunately did not pan out the way it was supposed to go for your Vegas Golden Knights. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about the former second overall pick in 2017, the Philadelphia Flyer turned Vegas Golden Knight, and that is Nolan Patrick. And before we get into this episode, go to www.prconnectionsradio.com, voice of new media. Check out all the amazing content we have on the network, including Vegas Hockey Hub. Follow us on social media at PR Connections. And if you want to follow your host, I'm also on all major platforms down below at Ian J. Rachiele. So really getting into this and talking about what happened with Nolan Patrick, well, to do that, you kind of have to establish some background on who Nolan Patrick is. Why, as an audience, should you care about Nolan Patrick? Because this was a guy who did not spend a lot of time in Vegas. As a matter of fact, he only spent this much of his time playing with the Golden Knights. However, the hype surrounding Nolan Patrick when he got drafted was intense. This was a guy who a lot of people was thinking could be a very good player at the NHL. I mean, you getting drafted second overall, you have to have some talent, some potential that they see in you to go second overall. And for a guy like Nolan Patrick, you got to also recall where he started at. Because when it comes to a guy like Nolan Patrick, this is who he was. He was playing in the WHL. He was winning out there in the Western Hockey League. And who was Nolan Patrick winning with? Who was the organization that Nolan Patrick was ending up playing for? Well, it just so happened to be an organization that your Vegas Golden Knights have been very accustomed to. An organization that has a relationship very trenched in the Golden Knights organization, as it was the Brandon Wheat Kings. And when it came to the Brandon Wheat Kings, their general manager, their owner, their coach for a good amount of years is current Vegas Golden Knights general manager, and that is Kelly McCrimmon. And with Kelly McCrimmon being at the helm and kind of being the guy who oversaw the Wheat Kings during that time, it was just so fascinating to see that a guy like Nolan Patrick was doing so well in the Western Hockey League and then transfer and trying to translate that over into the NHL. Just to establish the tone here was the statistics, and this is from Hockey Reference, by the way, of Nolan Patrick of his time in the Western Hockey League. So Nolan Patrick playing out there in the WHL, he spent 4 seasons playing in the WHL. Now, he only played 12 games in his first season, really a cup of coffee in 2014. But then in 2015, he played in 74 games for Brandon. He had 38 goals. He had 33 assists. And this was a guy in his first full season playing at the Western Hockey League, playing for the Brandon Wheat Kings. He had 71 points in that first season. So to really put that in perspective, for his first full season playing junior hockey, he almost averaged a point per game out there in the WHL. And it's also the same Brandon Wheat Kings that were in the Western Hockey League finals before losing to Kewanee out there in the WHL championship. So for the Brandon Wheat Kings, they had a really good 2015. Now, 2016 was the breakout season for Nolan Patrick. 2016 was the season where Nolan Patrick took off in terms of having a lot of people put eyeballs on him. As in 93 games, regular season and playoffs, Nolan Patrick had 54 goals in that season. He had 78 assists in that season. And Nolan Patrick put up 132 points in one season. Now, for some people, they don't even get 132 points in 4 years in junior hockey. Nolan Patrick, playing for the Brandon Wheat Kings, had a 132-point season in 1 year playing for Brandon. And that season in 2015-2016, he also helped the Brandon Wheat Kings not only win the Western Hockey League Championship over the Seattle Thunderbirds, but you also have to look at the Brandon Wheat Kings and see what they became afterwards. As once they went to the Memorial Cup in 2016, for anybody who doesn't know what the Memorial Cup is, that is when the winner of the QMJHL, the winner of the WHL, and the winner of the OHL, they meet up in a tournament called the Memorial Cup, and they crown a winner of the Memorial Cup. And even though the Brandon Wheat Kings finished 4th in the Memorial Cup that year, Nolan Patrick in the 2016 playoffs had 13 goals and 17 assists in 21 playoff games. Once again, this is both from Hockey Reference. So just imagine the hype surrounding Nolan Patrick. The fact that this guy put up one of the best seasons in junior hockey in 2015-2016, it really spotlighted how well Nolan Patrick's future was. This was somebody that so many people thought that he was going to be, an incredible player at the next level. I also want to remind people, by the way, that at 17 years old, he was doing this. At 17 years old, Nolan Patrick was already the Western Hockey League's Rookie of the Year. At 17 years old, he won the playoff MVP in the WHL. So in 2016-2017, his final season playing in junior hockey for Nolan Patrick, not only was he named captain of the Brandon Wheat Kings, which is important later on, but this is also the same Nolan Patrick that in his final season playing in Western Hockey League, he was a top prospect. He was one of the best touted prospects heading into 2017. The 2017 draft, by the way, was the first draft in Golden Knights history. It was going to be in Chicago. I vividly recall this because I actually watched the draft from T-Mobile Arena. They had a watch party after the expansion draft. They had a watch party at T-Mobile Arena, and we got to watch the Vegas Golden Knights have their draft picks in 2017. And even though they did get Cody Glass, Eric Brandstrom, and Nick Suzuki, they were not going to get Nolan Patrick. However, looking back at the 2017 NHL draft, it is actually crazy to look back in retrospect and with about 7 years of hindsight. Thinking about how Nolan Patrick was graded, by the way, and the fact that Nolan Patrick in the 2017 draft, he was rated even higher than Nico Hoischer, who was the number 1 draft pick in that class. Casey Middlestat was a highly touted player in that draft class. Gabe Velarde was a highly touted player during that draft. But weirdly enough, by the way, and this is going to be, by the way, my perspective here, the best player taken in this draft was taken at the end of the first round at pick 26. It's kind of crazy to look back and see the fact that Jake Ottinger was drafted at the end of the first round. It's kind of insane to really look at the fact that Robert Thomas was drafted 20th overall. that Nick Suzuki was drafted 13th overall. There was a lot of really good talent in this 2017 draft. I mean, I could really talk about Cale Makar, who I know a lot of people would put at number 1. But, man, this 2017 draft with Nolan Patrick in it, it was just really insane that at one point he was graded as the number 1 skater in this draft. And before the NHL draft lottery, if you actually go back and look at mock drafts during that time and actually look at, websites and go at Wayback Machine, Nolan Patrick was the projected number 1 pick on some draft boards. So what happened to Nolan Patrick in that final season in 2016-2017? Well, unfortunately for him, he suffered an upper body injury. So he suffered an injury, and because of that, he only played 33 games for the Brandon Wheat Kings. But despite missing a certain amount of games, he had 20 goals and 26 assists in a very limited schedule. So despite missing some time, he still scored 46 points in half a season, well over a point per game. And, heading into 2017, he goes to draft night. He gets drafted 2nd overall by the Philadelphia Flyers. And the Philadelphia Flyers organization, and I'm going to put this up on the screen right here. When it came to the Philadelphia Flyers organization, this was kind of a changing of the guard. There was kind of a rebuilding situation out there with the Philadelphia Flyers. If anybody recalls, back during this time, there was the good old veterans out there in 2016-2017, but there was also a situation where you had this influx of young players that were coming into the system with the Philadelphia Flyers, and Nolan Patrick was expected to be that guy. All right, this was a Philadelphia Flyers team that was a few years removed from being in the semifinals against New Jersey. All right, it had been a few years since then. And what happened with Nolan Patrick the first year the Philadelphia Flyers get there? Well, in 2017-2018, they would make the playoffs. They would lose in the first round to their good old buddies out there in Pittsburgh. But Philadelphia would make the playoffs in that situation. And how did Nolan Patrick do in his rookie season, 2017-2018? Well, this was a learning curve for Nolan Patrick, as in 79 games, he would have 14 goals, 18 assists for 32 points. Now, those are okay numbers. I mean, those are good numbers for most rookies, but you have to remember, he is the 2nd overall pick in this draft, right? So since he's the 2nd overall pick in this draft, 32 points in his first season. Well, let's compare that to the guy that he was drafted immediately behind in Nico Hischier. Well, how did he perform in 2017-2018? Well, he had 53 points in that first season, 21 of them being goals. So for a guy like Nolan Patrick, he unfortunately did not produce at the same level as the 1st overall pick, the guy that he was, kind of being compared to. That's what happens when you're the 1st overall versus 2nd overall. But it's okay. All right, he's going to rebound, right? You know what? That's the first year. He'll shake it off. Well, what if I unfortunately told you that that was the best season of his career? I'm not making that up. You can go on Hockey Reference. You can go on Elite Prospects. You can go on NHL.com. Nolan Patrick had his best performances in year 1 and in year 2. Nolan Patrick would make his only playoff appearance in the 2018 Stanley Cup playoffs for Philadelphia. Those 6 games that he played in the first round was the only sniff that Nolan Patrick would ever have of playoff potential. The following year for Nolan Patrick, he played in 72 games. He had 13 goals, 1 less than the year before. He had 31 points, one less than the year before. All right, 31 points in year 2. Unfortunately, that was a situation. He ended up just, having a very, kind of standard, year 2. Okay? Very standard year 2. Nothing to really complain about or anything like that. But still, that was, just a year 2, around the same points as the first year. Well, for Nico Heuscher, he had 17 goals and 47 points in that second year. So he even outperformed Nolan Patrick in that category there. Well, unfortunately for Nolan Patrick, he would not play in 2019-2020. As Nolan Patrick was during the offseason, okay? And this is from the Philadelphia Flyers, the report. I'm looking at an article from the Philadelphia Flyers organization. Nolan Patrick would begin to not feel well during training camp in 2019. And Nolan Patrick would go see a specialist. And that specialist would diagnose Nolan Patrick with a migraine disorder. And because that Nolan Patrick had this disorder, even though he was skating with the team at the end of 2020, Nolan Patrick would miss the entire 2019-2020 season. Now, am I going to sit here and blame him for that? No. Am I going to criticize him for missing an entire season? No. All right. When it comes to health, when it comes to your body, when it comes to your mental, when it comes to anything that involves your, physical, I'm not going to judge it. So Nolan Patrick did okay in year 1. He did all right in year 2, and he misses year 3. So how about his 4th and final season playing in Philadelphia? Well, in his 4th and final season, Nolan Patrick would play in just 52 of the 56 games that they had that year. Okay, he only missed 4 games. Well, Nolan Patrick only had 4 goals the entire year. He had 9 points the entire 52 games. Nolan Patrick ended up going from being a 30-point scorer in his first 2 seasons in the NHL to then not even being at a dozen points by the end of the year. And after that 2020-2021 season, Nolan Patrick would no longer be a Philadelphia Flyer. As, during the 2021 NHL offseason, it is July, teams are making trades, and the Philadelphia Flyers would have a 3-way trade that would be executed. It would be the Philadelphia Flyers, it would be the Nashville Predators, and it would be your Vegas Golden Knights. On one hand, the Philadelphia Flyers would trade Nolan Patrick and Philippe Myers. The Nashville Predators would trade defenseman Ryan Ellis. And the Vegas Golden Knights would trade Cody Glass. Now, the way this was done is that Nolan Patrick went to Vegas. Philippe Myers and Cody Glass went to Nashville. And Ryan Ellis went to Philadelphia. So for 2 draft picks in the 2017 NHL drafts, they were given a second chance. Cody Glass went over to Nashville. He had a few seasons being on the bottom 6 out there in Nashville. Now he is with the Pittsburgh Penguins organization because he got traded there during the 2024 offseason. Philippe Myers, I believe that he is in the minor leagues. I think he's with somebody else. Could be Toronto. I don't want to say anything wrong there. And Ryan Ellis got injured, had a career-ending injury, and he is probably never going to play again with the Philadelphia Flyers. So, why is this trade so important? Well, Nolan Patrick was going to be reunited with somebody. Nolan Patrick was going to be reunited with the one person who really saw his talent up close. He was going to be reacquainted with Kelly McCrimmon. So his head coach and his general manager during his days playing in the Western Hockey League would give him his second chance playing in the NHL. And when it came to Nolan Patrick, there was an interesting situation where the Vegas Golden Knights signed him to a 2-year deal immediately after getting traded to Vegas. So the Vegas Golden Knights agreed to give Kelly McCrimmon agreed to give Nolan Patrick $1.2 million for 21-22 and $1.2 million in 22-23. So how did Nolan Patrick do in 21-22? Well, unfortunately for Nolan Patrick, the thing of injuries would come back to be a fatal blow for him, as Nolan Patrick would play only 25 games as a Vegas Golden Knight. And after taking a hit from Nathan MacKinnon, he would never play in the NHL again. As a matter of fact, he would never play hockey ever again, as after suffering an injury towards the end of October, Nolan Patrick only had 2 goals and 7 points as a Vegas Golden Knight. And after having that upper body injury, the Vegas Golden Knights in 21-22, they would miss the playoffs, and Nolan Patrick would not be at training camp. In fact, Nolan Patrick would not even be on the roster. He would be on long-term IR for 22-23. And what so happened to happen in 22-23? Oh, that's right. Your Vegas Golden Knights would win a Stanley Cup. And even though Vegas won a Stanley Cup, Nolan Patrick would not be on the name. He would not be listed anywhere. And if you actually look at any source of hockey, he isn't even acknowledged as being a Stanley Cup champion, even though he was getting paid by the Vegas Golden Knights. And at the end of 2023, they would enter into the offseason. His 2-year deal would be up with the Golden Knights, and he would not be brought back to the organization. And after the 23-24 season, Nolan Patrick has not been signed anywhere. He has not been brought back. He has not had a PTO. He has not even been on an ATO. So what ended up happening with Nolan Patrick, you might ask? You know, what ended up happening when it came to him? Well, unfortunately, this is the last part we have to get to. Buckle up, because this is the interesting part here. As in December 19th, 2023, in the middle of the season, Nolan Patrick would go on social media and it would announce his retirement from professional hockey. And for someone like Nolan Patrick, to someone who was in his mid-20s, a second overall pick, for him to announce, and I think it was actually someone very close to him who actually originally came out with the news statement that Nolan Patrick was officially and formally announcing his retirement from professional hockey. Now, it was devastating and it was unfortunate to see. However, there is kind of a silver lining in this, and I will explain that in about half a minute. With Nolan Patrick, him retiring because of injuries. All right, he mostly had issues when it came to concussions. He had the migraine disorder. I mean, this was something in Nolan Patrick where, unfortunately, you know, he was just injury prone. There's nothing he could do about it. You know, that's one of the worst things I feel about when it comes to hockey, is if someone is injury prone, you know, if there's someone who just keeps getting injured and keeps on getting injured, I'm not going to sit there and bash them for constantly getting injured. All right, their body just isn't holding up, you know, or their mental is not holding up. I'm not going to bash that. So, unfortunately for Nolan Patrick, when he did announce his retirement, there were some people who were not surprised by it. considering the fact that he had not played in about 1.5 seasons at that point. But as according to his social media page, and I'm actually looking at his Instagram bio, Nolan Patrick is now a mentor. He is now a hockey coach, and he is helping out and providing skills to hockey players that are now trying to get into the NHL, or people trying to get into junior hockey. And I will say, on one hand, I will always appreciate when former players do something like that. Regardless of how great or how bad you were in the majors, it's kind of giving back, right? Giving back, being a mentor, being a coach, being a trainer, kind of doing stuff like that. I've always been able to appreciate when someone does that. So when it comes to Nolan Patrick, at this point in time, it looks like he has entered the second stage of his career, and he is now a mentor, and he is with a organization, and he is helping people, helping, juniors and kids when it comes to the NHL, trying to go into hockey. Now, for Nolan Patrick, there is one last thing I do want to mention very quickly, and we got about a few minutes left, so I just want to quickly mention that with Nolan Patrick, there is actually something I forgot to include. And that one part that I did not mention when it came to Nolan Patrick is the fact that he comes from a hockey family. And when it comes to Nolan Patrick, very interesting the part that when it comes to his dad played over 200 games in the NHL, as his dad is Steve Patrick, someone who actually was a first-round pick by the Buffalo Sabres back in the 80s. This is someone who spent a good amount of time and played a good amount of seasons in between the AHL, NHL, and Steve Patrick is actually with the Brandon Wheat Kings when he played back in the 70s. And then Nolan Patrick, about 4 decades later, his son plays for the Brandon Wheat Kings. That's kind of a nice touch there. When it came to his mom played volleyball at University of Winnipeg. And of course, I'm getting a lot of this information when it comes to his pages and everything like that. However, when it comes to Nolan Patrick's family, it's just really interesting to see what his family has done. This is someone, like, for example, his grandpa was a football player. He played for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the Canadian Football League. His uncle is James Patrick. And that name sounds familiar. That's because he played over 1,000 games in the NHL, and he has spent well over 20 years playing in the NHL for various teams. So, overall, when it comes to Nolan Patrick, he had the lineage, all right? I think that would be the word that you would say. He came from a family of people who knew hockey. Like I said, his dad played in the NHL. His uncle played in the NHL. I also want to mention that even his uncle, even his other uncle played in the NHL, and I really sit there and look at it and go, him coming from a hockey family, it was just kind of incredible what he did growing up. And I will point out that one season he had with the Brandon Wheat Kings, scoring over 100 points in the regular season, and then having that amazing playoff run that he had in 2016. So for Nolan Patrick, kind of wrapping this all up here, I will conclude by saying that when it comes to Nolan Patrick, having those injuries, it affected him mightily, and he had the potential, he had the talent, but at the end of the day, Nolan Patrick, unfortunately, just ended up being I'm not even going to say bust, because when you have injury-prone players, it always feels kind of unfair to list them as a bust. What I will say is that he was underwhelming as a second overall pick. He did not reach his full potential as a second overall pick. And that Kelly McCrimmon connection was how he got to Vegas. That Kelly McCrimmon connection is what got him that second chance when he did play 25 games for Vegas. So this is the video about what happened to Nolan Patrick. And until next time, I'm your host, Ian Rachiele, and this is Vegas Hockey Hub. Go Knights, go.
PR Connections Radio thanks you for watching this podcast. Check out more episodes of this show and our others at prconnectionsradio.com.